Welcome to the 5 Foot Man podcast. I am your host, Shane Hazen. Coming up on this episode, we got another special one in terms of great career legendary editors. Tim Squires. Tim has edited for Stephen Gagain, Robert Altman, and he's edited, with the exception of one film, every film of Ang Lee's, every feature of Ang Lee's. But of note, he also did 2 films for Jonathan Demme, including the movie we're discussing today, a movie that is really dear to my heart, to the extent where hopefully we make the case for it, just because I know some people, friends, don't understand why I love this movie as much. Jonathan Demme's Rachel Getting Married. But first up, what I watched this week. I've been diving into the Criterion Channel's neo-noir series, which I ignored for way too long because some of the titles on there, most of the titles there I'd already seen, but ignoring the fact that the ones I hadn't seen were very worthwhile. The coolest thing I saw this week was directed by Barry Shear, Across 110th Street, which Barry Shear is a white filmmaker, and he made this AIP kind of batshit movie that I don't want to say I'm fond of it. I find it interesting. Wild in the Streets, about youth uprising. And the most notable thing about this movie, besides it stars Anthony Quinn and Yaphet Kotto, and probably the MVP performance in this is Anthony Francioso, who's kind of the villain gangster in this and just kind of runs away with the movie. But what's also notable about this is it was shot on location in Harlem, as the title indicates, above 110th Street. And it's shot on these RE cameras that were very tiny and lightweight, that were very new at the time. So the location work in this movie is striking and just very intimate. You know, it precedes Chinatown always had that reputation of being a movie that got into rooms very tightly and being very intimate. This movie does that too. On top of the fact, this movie just race relations in this movie are very modern and probably ahead of its time, and yet the movie doesn't pull punches, especially by the time it gets to the end. I still have a big chunk of neo-noir still on the list to look through. I mean, I just started my first Robert Mitchum, Raymond Chandler adaptation of those 70s ones, which I'll probably have something to say about those when I've seen a few more next week. Interesting. But most people know Across 110th Street for the title Bobby Womack song, which is the from last week's episode on Tarantino. It's the final song of the movie of Jackie Brown, used to, speaking of intimacy, one of the most intimate moments in any of his films. So this is a long, great talk. The first half of it is much like the Billy Weber episode. The first half of this goes into Tim's career. Like, we get more than halfway through the episode before we actually even get to Rachel Getting Married. And as I mentioned, he's worked with Ang Lee's entire life. And this conversation gets very tech heavy. And one of the interesting parts of it is being someone who's worked in the high frame rate with both Billy Lynn's Halftime Song and Gemini Man. We go into the weeds on the high frame rate, and Tim's very honest about its benefits, why it maybe didn't work, and what his future lies, and he does sound optimistic about it on that regard. But this is I'm really excited we got him. Anyway, onwards with Tim Squires. So, what were movies like for you as a kid?
Well, I always watched, I was always a big movie watcher on TV. And then later on, when I was in high school, I would go to the movies by myself a lot because I couldn't talk my friends into going to see all the movies that I wanted to see. In fact, once back then, in order to find out the movie times, you had to call the theater and listen to a recording playback. And once, when I was a senior in high school, in gym class, I got a concussion, and they took me to the nurse's office and asked for my mother's phone number at work. And the number I gave them was the number from a movie theater that I hadn't called in probably 2 years. But that's just the number that bubbled up in my head. my scrambled head.
because it was so familiar to you. Oh
Yeah,
man,
yeah.
I worked at a movie theater as a teenager, but I still to this day have that movie theater's number memorized for having to
Wow.
call for.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Like, what were the movies you were watching?
Um, one of the big ones I remember going to see that really blew me away was Days of Heaven,
Huh.
which I could not convince any of my friends to go see this weird movie. So I rode my bike down to Glassboro and went and saw it and just was in a daze going all the way going home because it's such a astounding movie. And I convinced some of my friends to see it, and they said, "Oh, that was kind of weird." But and actually recently my daughters watched it. I told them they had to watch it, and they did appreciate it properly.
They did take to it, right? I have a similar experience.
Oh yeah, they loved it.
Not to date everything. I have a similar experience with Thin Red Line.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, I mean, it's amazing a movie like that. Were you getting a lot of movies like that? Were you like into the '70s? Like what the platform releasing was starting to, or the was starting to go away, I guess, and everyone was starting to throw the major releases. So were you still getting? I mean, Days of Heaven was a big Paramount release, wasn't it, or
Yeah.
something
Oh
that would
yeah.
have gone to a.
Yeah. It wasn't an obscure little art house movie. It was, it was where I saw it was a little, multiplex in a shopping mall. It wasn't a little art house theater.
I guess that blows my mind. You're watching Days of Heaven in a shopping mall. What were some other movies you were seeing around this time?
uh, let's see. Well, my more interesting movie watching experience was after I went to college.
Okay,
Um,
where'd you go to college?
I went to Cornell,
Okay.
and I was not planning on going into film at all. If you were planning on going into film at that time, you wouldn't go to Cornell. But Cornell had a very robust movie screening program, and they showed probably 400 titles a year because this was before Netflix. So if you wanted to see movies, that's how you had to do it. And so over time, I was seeing so many movies. I figured, well, I should get on the board that picks the movies. So I did, and was seeing 100, 150 movies a year for quite a while. And so yeah, that's when I really discovered Robert Altman and all of the Fellini, Antonioni, all the big foreign directors, which I really wasn't aware of before I went to college, but I saw everything. Um,
Okay.
and you would kind of schedule once I was on the board picking the movies, you'd kind of make series out of things. And so I would just look through the catalog and find out movies that I wanted to see and then find some way that I could make a series out of them. Um, and so I wound up being able to just kind of pick what old movies I wanted to watch and be able to actually schedule them.
Do you remember any of the series that you put
Oh,
on?
no, no, I'm afraid I don't.
I think one of my comment or my frequent co-host Ted Haycraft, I think he's similar age point, and he would also at this very same time because he would mention Days of Heaven as a movie that he was going to college at the exact same time, and he was talking about that the ability to program a campus, what movies were coming in was he generationally he's always jealous of us, someone like me younger who had VHS, and then everyone else who had streaming beyond that who could like
Yeah,
choose what they watch and saw. And whereas he was talking about stories about pilfering friends HBO and taping stuff off that, or using a catalog while you're programming a programming candidate. But so when did
yeah.
so I assume when did editing start to come into play, or when did you start thinking about editing?
Well, while I was in college, at one point I was starting to question whether I really wanted to be a physics major. And I'd always been interested in film, but I'd never thought about it as a thing to actually do. And then I took a filmmaking course, a beginning filmmaking course. And all there was at Cornell was beginning and intermediate filmmaking. That was the entire curriculum.
What does that entail at Cornell?
At that time, we had a couple of Bolexes and a bunch of wind-up Bell and Howells and some simple recording equipment and some very simple lights, and that's about it. And so it was mostly experimental films. People weren't really shooting, shooting narratives because just our sound capabilities weren't conducive to that. So I took beginning class, and then I was the teaching assistant for several years. And so as a teaching assistant, and I worked for the university. They had a division where they um, produced educational films for New York State and a bunch of other things. And I was a director and a camera operator at the public access station downtown, and just kind of did everything you could do in Ithaca in film. But I was mostly kind of directing and doing camera.
Okay.
But as a teaching assistant, all your students go out and they shoot a bunch of stuff, and then they come back and go, "What am I going to do with this?" And so I would wind up helping them in the editing room more than anywhere else. Uh, and so I sort of, had a hand in editing dozens and dozens of films of these students that went through. And then when I came to New York, one of my friends was going to film school at NYU, and I did sound for a bunch of people's films at NYU. I wasn't enrolled, but I did sound for people, and then I
Okay.
cut my friend's film, and then I cut several other people's films. And then just coincidentally, some of the people that I met, through weird connections, were editors after I came to New York. And so some of I was doing anything I could. And so I did a bunch of different jobs, but including that was editorial stuff. And I kind of quickly realized that I liked that job better. The one of the great things about editing is it's one of the very few jobs on a movie where you're involved in the whole thing, where you're telling the whole story. You're not doing your piece and handing it off. And also my piece as editor is last. Nobody can fix my mistakes. Nobody can mess up what I've done. It's just, we're finishing telling the story. So, for those creative reasons, and also, I did a lot of boom operating and other kinds of things that had me on set. And it's cold. You're outside freezing. The last day of boom operating I did uh, was in it. The film was called Anna. With Sally Kirkland actually got a Best Actress nomination for it. But
Okay.
I was a substitute boom operator for a day, and it was in a theater. It was like during an audition scene in a Broadway theater, and so they were shooting a lot of wide shots. So I'm walking up and down on apple boxes with this boom extended out to 20 feet um, all day, and at the end of the day, you're just dead after that. And oddly enough, I wound up as supervising sound editor on that same movie. Pure
Okay.
coincidence. Um, but every now and then I would just slam my headphones down and say, "Who boomed this crap?"
I've had this happen before. Director, sometimes when you're wanting to like cut something or like point out like you're just like this isn't working. One of their excuses is you weren't there that day. You don't know how cold it was.
Yeah,
You don't
yeah,
know how muddy or wet it was.
yeah. We always say it got really crazy out there. Whenever you get the dailies and go, "What the hell were they doing?"
And then they turn around and like you're in an air conditioned editing room talking about
Yeah,
this.
and you go, "Yeah, I am. I'm glad." But yeah, sometimes you're when you're shooting out in the real world. Sometimes you're limited by a lot of things, and sometimes that shows in the footage that they just couldn't get what they would have gotten if they'd had control over everything.
So, from you were supervising sound editor on Anna, and was from there you're just kind of staying in post.
And a couple others
You
too.
stayed in post from that point.
Yeah, I mean the first thing I did was I was picture assistant on a feature, but it was such a low budget feature, and you've never heard of it. There were only two of us. It was just me and the editor. And so
Okay.
even though I had never touched 35 millimeter film before, on that film I wound up um, editing. Let's see. Yeah, I was sound editor. I cut all the production tracks and the ADR and the editor cut all the effects and music, and so that was the first film I ever worked on. And then there were a couple of films where that with that same editor, a guy named John Tintori. He I was assistant editor and then supervising sound editor. So I was kind of going back and forth between picture and sound, and then I was doing a lot of other kind of TV stuff too.
Well, that sounds like that helps you, especially for the movie we're going to talk about, but also things like I'm wanting to pick your brain about your Altman work. Like it seems like fixing sound on a shoot that's like shot kind of run and gun like this, like would be something that would be kind of instrumental in figuring those things out.
Yeah, I mean, as a, I mean, they call the job picture editor, but you're really doing sound editing too. I mean, you take it up to a certain point, um, and then the
Sure.
sound editors take it the rest of the way. It's, that's always a tricky thing when you're editing is how good do I want to make the sound? I want
Yeah.
to make it as good as I can, but at the same time, if I'm out to 40 tracks and I want to trim picture, it's a big pain in the neck. So you have to kind of know where to draw the line. But years ago, um, editing on film, for example, when you were screening, you're running off 2 tracks of mag, and that was all you could do, and everything was mono.
Hmm.
And then as people switched to digital editing, and as the digital editing got more capable, um, people have come to you can do more, and then as you do more, people expect more, to the point where now you have to make something sound really good if you want to show it to a studio or to an audience, especially to a studio, because they just don't know how to watch things that don't sound like a movie. So I now edit in 5.1 audio and do a proper mix. Again, you have to know where to draw the line, because you have to, I want to leave something for the sound editors, but also they have expertise that goes beyond mine, and I want to use their stuff, but at the same time, sound is really important. Sound's a very important part of how the audience experiences the movie. And if sitting in the editing room, I'm not experiencing it in some sort of reasonable simulation of that, I'm not actually watching the movie. So yeah, sound is very important.
The crazier thing I always find having to explain to somebody about going into a deep dive on sound is that sometimes, you mentioned earlier about being a picture editor, the sound editing you do guides the eye across a frame
Oh
of
yeah,
of a
yeah,
certain
very
way.
much.
Like, but then at the same time, it's also hearing you talk about. I never had to work on 35. I was always on digital, but it's just it's time management. Time management is always like another big thing in editing where you're like you can do this deep dive into something that's ultimately going to be changed and doesn't matter too, or just like isn't working, but you think one little detail, one little frame to the difference is going to make this work, and you just keep pushing and pushing, and you shouldn't have spent this time on it.
Yeah, yeah. One interesting thing I found is I used to work in stereo. I mean, I used to work in direct out, then I switched to stereo because it gave you a lot more freedom, and now I work in 5.1. But back when I was working in stereo, or in direct out, either way, just working with 2 speakers or 3, I would always tell the director, because sometimes it'd be hard to hear something, and I'd tell the director, "Oh, once we're in 7.1 and if this can all spread out, it'll be okay." But I never
Hmm.
knew if I was lying or not.
Fair enough.
So that's one of the reasons. Once we had a really good room, because for Life of Pi we built a room, and I've cut a bunch of features there, a good 7.1 room. Now I know if I'm lying or not. Now I know if there's a real issue. Um,
Was that your first 7-1 movie? I've never done a 7-1 movie.
yeah, I mean to edit in 7.1, yeah,
Mm,
because we cut Life of Pi. Actually, no, my first 5.1 movie to cut might have been Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk.
wow.
To
Okay.
work that way the whole time. Um, I cut in 5.1, and we had for complicated technical reasons, I stayed in LCR on Life of Pi.
Is that very assistant intensive where you're having them do some of the separations and
Well, I mean, to mix it, no, it kind of has to be in my room.
Okay.
because I'm the one with the big setup. But for for a film like Rachel Getting Married or Gosford Park, where everybody's wearing a microphone, the way they give audio to me is the person on set, the sound mixer on set, does a mix track, and that's channel one. But then I have everybody's solo mic, everybody's wearing a mic, and I've got all those. So
Right.
I initially cut with the mix track, but then kind of once pictures farther along, I'd have my assistants go back and listen to all the isolated tracks and find me all the good stuff there too, and then kind of figure out what of those I want to use. And if you don't see the person, you don't have to use them in sync, so you can slide them around and drop them in wherever it's useful. So that's where my assistants would really spend a bunch of time going through every track on a film like that.
So you mentioned Ang Lee. Ang Lee, Pushing Hands was your first feature,
Yeah.
and he directed.
Yes, that was his first feature, my second.
What was your first one?
My first one, you've never seen this one either. It's called Blowback.
Okay.
But Blowback, the first assistant editor, or the first AD, was Ted Hope. Ted then joined up with James Schamus. They formed Good Machine, and that Good Machine is the company that
Okay.
financed, or they didn't finance, they produced Ang's first bunch of movies. And they were looking for an editor. It would have helped if they had found one who spoke Mandarin, but they couldn't, and I didn't. Um, but Ted said, "Oh, I know somebody who'll work for cheap," and they called me.
Oh, the great calling card of working for cheap.
Yep.
Ted Hope. I mean, have you ever read his book, Hope on Film?
No, I haven't. I should.
I'm a big fan of it. There's a lot, and the thing is, it's like a few years old. Like an updated version of it is like picking that guy's brain. That sounds like he always seems like he's on the edge of like what is going to make film work as a medium, and constantly, like especially after COVID year. Like I would want to hear more what he has to think right now. But um, so what was the first? What was Pushing Hands like? What was that the first? Your second feature? What was that experience like?
Pushing Hands, that was, I mean, first I had to working with a new director, so you have to figure out what your relationship is going to be. We were cutting on film. This was in 1991, and it was quick. I mean, it was I think, an 18-day shoot, and we did the whole thing in 4 or 5 months. So
Okay.
it was quick, but Ang had never worked with an editor before. Before that, when he was in NYU, he had done student films, but he had never worked with an editor before, so he didn't know how to work with somebody, let alone in a language that was not his first language, and that at the time he wasn't terribly strong with. So it was very kind of roundabout. He would, I'd say, so should we trim these 16 frames and get that little look off? And then we would talk for 10 minutes about, old stories and cooking cooking stories and Chinese legends and things. And then after 15 minutes, I'd say, okay, so what about these 16 frames? That we would there was this kind of very roundabout way that I could do something and then get his response to it. But it was a fairly straightforward movie. Um, but it's interesting, those kinds of films. There are a lot of complicated problems that have to be solved on a film that's shot quickly like that. So I was just happy to be cutting a movie. Now it didn't. It was a mostly foreign language film. It's about half and half,
Okay.
half English, half Mandarin, and so I had to figure out how to do that, how to cut in a language I didn't speak, which I've now done a bunch of times. Um, and but it was for a foreign audience. It was with foreign money for a foreign audience. There were no American studios or anything like that to satisfy. Which just whenever we said we were done, we were done. And it was a big hit in Taiwan. but it wasn't released here until years later. It got a very tiny little art house release in 1995, I think.
This
Um,
would have been around time of Sense and Sensibility, I guess.
yeah, I think while we were shooting Sense and Sensibility, it ran at the Quad for a couple of weeks or something like that.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, so it felt like a hobby. It kind of didn't feel like we were making a real movie. And then with the Wedding Banquet, it felt like the same. And then it won the grand prize at Berlin, which I, I was so confused because that's what real movies do. I didn't realize we were a real movie. And I don't know if it's
Um,
interesting. We cut The Wedding Banquet in 1992 on an Avid, which is one of the very first movies ever cut on an Avid. I don't know if your audience would be interested in that at all.
sure, yeah. How many movies did you cut on film then?
Just two,
Okay.
just Blowback and Pushing Hands, because then we did in 1992 we did The Wedding Banquet on an Avid, and entirely on an Avid. It wasn't some kind of hybrid system. The first film I ever saw was an answer print, which is terrifying because at that time, the way that I was working from 3/4 inch beta tapes that we loaded in the Avid, and the transfers weren't very good, so I didn't really know what the movie looked like until answer print, and it was a little bit shocking because there are things that we could see that we hadn't been able to see before. Um, and we only had 7.5 gigabytes of storage for the entire movie, which
Wow.
isn't because they were, the drives were huge and really expensive. So my assistant, Pam Martin, who's now an Academy nominee herself, um, she, one of her jobs was to make sure that I had that whatever I was going to be working on the next day was loaded in the Avid because we couldn't keep everything on. So it was complicated cutting a film on the Avid. But the great thing about it was, whereas on Pushing Hands, Ang and I had to talk a lot before making a decision because you have to, when you're doing it on film, you're doing it destructively and it's time consuming. On the Avid, if I wasn't sure about something, I would just do it and show it to him. And if it wasn't good, I just undo it. We could work so much faster because we didn't have to go and talk and talk and talk through everything. And the great thing that I discovered about working digitally is, you used to, if the director had an idea and you thought it was a bad idea, you'd have to talk about it. You'd have to, because I know it's going to be a mess, and then I got to put everything back together, and it's a big deal. And on the Avid, just make a copy and do it. And sometimes I find out, sometimes the director sees, oh yeah, that's not going to work, but it gives us a new idea. Or sometimes I find out I'm not as smart as I thought I was, and that actually is a good idea. And
Yeah.
so you can, you can, it still takes, it's not like it's sped up post production a lot, but you get to try a lot more things
Well, the
and,
trying
and
always
thus
seems
be
to
a
speed
lot more
stuff out.
confident.
Yeah.
But I had before then I had cut a lot on tape, which is linear editing, and I'd cut a lot on film, which is nonlinear editing. So I would approach each edit either with one mindset or the other. And then over time, you kind of learn, oh no, you don't have to conceptualize it this way or that way. There's a whole new thing available. And so, the editing, it's what you're doing with your hands and in the software, but also how you're thinking about what you're doing. And you need to develop that. Now, everybody today learns that way, but all of us old timers who had to make the transition, you had to go through this process of rethinking, relearning how to do the things you do. So
I
it was
would
it was interesting. And at that time, in 1992, you know, we had the manual. I read the editor's manual, Pam read the assistant's manual, and then I started working. And after a couple of weeks, we traded manuals, and then we read them again. But um, there was nobody to ask questions of. I mean, we were kind of inventing the whole process.
Whenever
Not
I've
just
worked with old editors, one of the things I've had conversations with other newer editors about it. Just the fact that it's been pointed out, the talking, like the longer the talking to think about before doing something, especially even after we switched over to digital. But I've also heard, and it makes a lot of sense, that even though I haven't really experienced the way of doing it, that it still doesn't take much more or less time, just because now with Avid, when you try more stuff, that picks up the time that used to be for technical stuff and talking stuff through.
Yeah, I mean, you still talk things through, but you get to talk them through after you've done it. So you get to
Right.
you can base your opinions on having actually tried it and seen it, not imagining it. So that is often, and often you don't have to talk about it because you look out and go, "Oh, that didn't work. It seemed like it was going to work, but it didn't work." Um, so yeah, it changes it changes the discussion. But what I like is being able to do things based on having actually tried it, making
Right. Right.
decisions based on, here's what it is, like here's this scene cut in the close-ups. I know you wanted it in the close-ups. Here it is in the close-ups. I think it works better in the medium shots, and here's that. So, but I don't have to cut the scene in the medium shots and then have them say, "Oh, I wanted to see it in the close-ups," and say, "Yeah, I tried that. It didn't work." You know, I can say, "Here it is."
How many people, when you started on Avid, had been working on Avid?
I think zero.
I
I
know
mean,
of like
for features,
the Sex Lies videotape book talks about Soderbergh doing. I think it's an early version of Avid, or he's doing some kind of.
it wasn't. Yeah,
It
Avid
wasn't
wasn't
Avid.
wasn't around then. I mean, Sex Lies and Videotape was in
It's
989, I
89,
think.
90.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm not sure what he was working on, but
Okay,
there was the montage system with
that's
the
maybe what I'm thinking of.
30 tape decks. Somebody was using that at Sound One while we were doing Dogfight, I think, or True Love. No, Dogfight. So yeah, there were other systems besides Avid.
When you say tape, like I'm having trouble visualizing this. Like like you had a certain amount of tape decks that the computer clips then can only access, or like how does it, like,
Well, you mean the montage system?
or I mean early Avid with the
Oh,
with
early Avid, you had, it worked the same as it does now, except rather than everything being file based, you got your dailies on tape, and you would have to go through, and you would get a file with it that told you what was on the tape, um, and you would digitize from the tape in real time. And so then you could always, because we only had 7.5 gigabytes, we could delete stuff, to free up space for something else. And then when we wanted it back, we'd have to load the tapes again and reload
okay.
all those tapes in real time. So the tapes all lived over on the shelves, and so you had access to all your media there. Great thing that it could do is you could hook up two decks, and when you had a cut that you wanted to screen, rather than, we didn't have film. So rather than screen an Avid output, um, it would auto conform your tapes. You would just feed it
Huh.
tapes, and it would build in a linear fashion. It would build on a source tape, cuts only. It would build your cut, and so we'd screen it that way. So we would get to screen it at, you know SD resolution, but that was much better than what was in the Avid at the time.
So how consistently were you working around this time for over these years?
Oh, very, very. I was doing a lot of things besides features.
Okay.
I was doing just, things for VH1 and low budget commercials and industrials and all kinds of things. So I was working very steadily, but
This was your feature stuff, though.
yeah, right. I mean, right before Pushing Hands, there was a film called Dogfight that Nancy Savoca directed, that John Tintori edited. It's River Phoenix and Lily Taylor, and that's another one where I was picture assistant and supervising sound editor. So
Okay.
that's what I did. That was the job, and then I did a couple little things, and then I did Pushing Hands next.
So you've stayed with Ang Lee his entire career.
I've done all but one,
What was the?
just one. I didn't do Brokeback Mountain,
Oh, okay.
and that was a scheduling issue. He told me after we finished Hulk, he told me he was going to take a year off,
Uh huh.
and I signed on to Syriana, and then Brokeback Mountain came together real quickly, and I thought, oh no. And then I
Mm.
read the script and said, "Oh no," because it was a great script. It was a really great script. And he and I talked a lot. And it looked like Syriana was going to be it was much more of a big studio film and looked a lot more commercial and was far more complicated from an editorial standpoint than, that was, cutting between five different stories. And Brokeback Mountain was very straightforward.
Mhm.
And ultimately, we decided, it would have been kind of bad if I had bailed out on Syriana. So ultimately, we decided that I should do Syriana, and so he did Brokeback without me.
So the podcast idea here is that like I pick a lot of favorite movies that I don't think other people appreciate enough.
Yeah.
And when I was going through your resume, there were three movies that stood out. There was this one we're doing, Rachel Getting Married. There was Syriana and Hulk. Like Hulk is a just like frustratingly underappreciated movie.
Hulk was an interesting one.
Well, just the editing alone, like the split screen,
Yeah,
the amount of work that went into it.
yeah. Hulk has some problems,
Sure.
but from an editorial standpoint, you know, Ang was very interested in we looked at a lot of graphic novels, and there's some great graphic novels around Hulk and around a lot of other comics. And
Hmm.
he wanted to be take inspiration from that. That was before Marvel had this formula that they have now, very successful formula,
Right.
but this was
Right.
before that existed. We started shooting Hulk in January of, or no, March of 2002. So, um, so we did some tests. The film that he shot before that was called Ride with the Devil, which you should see, especially if you get a chance to see it. Watch the Criterion version, not the theatrical version.
I was just gonna say there's a Criterion version of it. Yeah.
The Criterion version is better. Yeah, we fixed a couple of mistakes.
Okay. Okay.
Um, and the So we did some tests, some kind of tests with footage from that, with split screens and things. But the way you experience a graphic novel is completely different from the way you experience a movie. You look at you turn the page, you take in the graphic design of the page, but then you still read the panels, or however it's you read it sequentially. A movie, you're not in charge of how things are presented to you in time. That's what we do. So we did some tests, and then I went away. I went and spent a couple months in London finishing Gosford Park. And while I was there, I thought a lot about it and came up with some ideas. And then I actually started 2 months before we started shooting on Hulk, uh, and hired some actors, and we went out and shot about 30 scenes from the movie. And then I just acquired a whole bunch of other footage, from biology documentaries and animations and things, and just played for a couple months and came up with what I thought was going to be sort of the language of the film.
Did you read any of like Will Eisner or Scott McCloud stuff when figuring this
No,
out?
oh, well, I was there, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yes,
The
of course, I read both of them.
Okay, yeah. Understanding comics is one of those things I read as a
Yeah,
kid.
the Scott McCloud. Yeah, I love that book.
Yeah.
Um, so then when they started shooting, Ang told me anything you can think of. Hey, if it's too much, we'll dial it back, but anything you can think of. And I was trying to. So the film was assembled right from the first day I got the footage. I was doing that stuff, that combining things, and it's not simply split screens. It's a lot more complicated stuff than that.
Right, right, right.
And um, I kind of thought early on I would keep two versions of the film, one with all that stuff, and then one that's just straight cutting. But I quickly had to abandon the straight cutting one because it just wasn't going to happen. I couldn't do both. And there are scenes like there's right near the beginning of the movie. There's a scene where they're doing an experiment on a frog, exposing it to gamma radiation, and you think about the scene. It's a bunch of people sitting in a room watching stuff on computer monitors. It's the most boring thing you can imagine, even if what's happening on the screens is vaguely interesting. And if I hadn't been able to be flying things in and out and swooshing them around, that scene would have been almost unwatchable. Um, but in this case, because I could do that, it sort of goes by as a fun scene, even though if you think about it, it's kind of dull. Uh,
Sure.
so yeah, that one, and none of that, with the except in that one scene, there was one snap zoom, a zoom back from the frog from back to the high point in the back of the room. That was planned on set. That's the only thing that was planned on set. Everything else that's in that movie was stuff that we cooked up in post.
I gotta tell you, it's really heartening to know that, because especially you mentioning time, like we do a lot of comic book shows on here too, and comic book related
Yeah.
stuff, and a lot of the theory behind the differences between movies and comics. There's a really pedestrian way of looking at it where, especially early on before this comic revolution or of movies, more comic book movies, people were treating comics as storyboards, and like more theoreticians like Scott McCloud or Will Eisner would talk about the differences, wait, like in a Tarkovsky-esque way of like the differences between time and film versus the time in comics. And I remember feeling that when watching Hulk, and trying to like tell my friends like there's way more to this movie, and it's just really heartening to know that like that was in the thought process and that was part of the thinking going and how the montage came together on that.
Yeah, it was, once you start getting into that, realize that you've got a whole new aesthetic that's available to you in terms of how to get from one shot to the other to the next. You just start trying things and you get ideas, and you just try messing around with things. And we've done that a little bit. There was some fancy things in Life of Pi that
Mm.
that kind of came from that. And some of those were planned and some were not. Actually, the ones that were planned, it was my job to plan them. So again, I shot the scenes with other actors and went back and planned everything out about here's how we're going to do these transitions. Um, but yeah, that it was by the end, I kind of felt initially it was just trying whatever came into our heads. Me and my assistant, who then became visual effects editor, Gary Levy. Um, there's one place where there's a plant. It's sort of an aloe plant with all these spiky things. And I told him, see these spiky things? That's on the incoming shot. There's the outgoing shot is something else, and I want to cut to this shot, but instead of cutting, we want to animate this thing in. So see these spikes, animate these couple points out. And so he did like 4 of them. And I said, okay, that's great. Now do twice as many. And then he went back and did it. And then eventually, we had a whole bunch of them. And it looks great. And it's just kind of whatever came into our heads. And then, over time, you kind of realize, oh, this is actually sort of a coherent aesthetic. Because then, to execute these things requires, ILM was our visual effects vendor on that, and they had to uh, actually execute all these things at high res. And and I encouraged them to be creative, but when they were, often just the things they did they somehow they felt outside of the aesthetic. And that's when I realized, oh, this actually is sort of a coherent aesthetic, and it was largely defined by what was in the Avid effects palette at that time. Um,
What kind of stuff
but
were they trying to do? Like 3Ding out stuff, or just like
yeah, it was some 3D stuff, and we did some 3D stuff. I mean, there's one place where we actually scan across a whole bunch of comic book panels, and the first time we do it, we're on a shot, and then we just move down diagonally and go across, and you see some other rectangles, kind of going through, and then we land on another one. The second time, it's like the camera's looking down on a page of comic books. Initially, it's just a shot, but instead of just sliding, it went up. It pulled up and then slid and then went down again. You could feel that it was a 3D thing. And you couldn't do that in Media Composer at the time. We had to build that in After
mm,
Effects. And then the third time, the camera pulls up and then tilts. And so you can see this whole plane of these images. And then we moved and went in on another one. So it's just kind of taking the concept and advancing it a little bit each time. Um, but it's hard to kind of describe what the what the aesthetic was. But we learned a new way of editing that they'll probably never use again. because
That's the
they
disappointing thing to me. Like,
yeah,
it seems like a very promising. Like what you're describing there reminds me of Scott McCloud's second comic book on comics, reinventing comics, which didn't really
yeah,
take off. But like, there was a lot of stuff about when if you were doing online comics and you weren't bound by a page, that you could just go panel to panel, like across, like, like, there was no bound shape to it. You can just go forever going for the differences between panel and panel, which is how time is measured and how stories are told. And I don't know. I just hope someone takes up you guys'
yeah,
aesthetic on that.
yeah. Yeah, well, we did, in Life of Pi, there were some kind of similar things. There was one place in Life of Pi where we're kind of, the beginning part of Life of Pi is we're cutting back and forth between adult Pi and Rafe Spall's character in Montreal telling stories and the stories that he's telling. So that kind of sets you up for doing things that are kind of fanciful. And there's one place where I had a wide shot of this temple at night with a whole bunch of candles in the water, and it's a big, beautiful shot. And I had to cut to a wide shot of looking across this valley during the day. And cutting from a big wide shot to a big wide shot is not easy. And once I had this voice of Aang in my head. I was trying something else and I didn't like it, and then I had this heard Aang's voice in my head, just anything you can think of. And
Hmm.
so this one, I had to go tell my assistant, okay, so we're looking at this temple at night. Let's, have a starry sky, and now tilt up, and faster as we go up. So the camera goes straight overhead and back down, and twist as you come back down. So as you come back down, we're not upside down, and we're coming down. And as we go over the top, it goes from night to day. And then as we come down, we're in this other scene, as if we tilt down into it. And once you start thinking, oh, I'm allowed to do that, it's a great transition in Life of Pi. And my assistant mocked it up, and then we wound up executing it for the movie. He spent
Wow.
probably 2 days on it.
I was gonna say that's an intensive mock-up.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, he's very good. It's Mike Fay.
I mean, you've worked with Ang Lee your entire career, obviously. Like, it just your collaboration sounds so tight. Like, it's like, just this is the thing editors dream of, like being able to, like, do you do second unit directing or anything, or is it just pre-production stuff?
Yeah, no, I did some second unit directing on Hulk. Actually, that frog scene, I shot all the monitor stuff and a bunch of the equipment at the beginning where she's getting everything ready. I
Hmm.
did all that. On Life of Pi, I kind of sort of directed some of the second unit. There was an insert unit on the lifeboat, and I was there in Taiwan for a bunch of it. And sometimes, if just you're the guy who knows exactly what you need, so
Are you on set a lot?
not usually.
Okay.
Um, in Life of Pi, I mean, usually like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, that was a 129-day shoot. In
Jesus.
China, I was in New York. He and Ang and I talked twice during the entire shoot. Um,
Jesus.
yeah, and sometimes I was getting footage a month after they shot it.
What was your response whenever that was going to be his next movie? That was after Ride of the
Um,
Devil, right?
no, that was after. Yes, sorry, that was after Ride with the Devil. Um, I kept getting drafts to it, but the drafts that I got, the scripts that I got were, um, it was written in Mandarin and then translated into English by a native Mandarin speaker, which is not how you're supposed to do translations. And I couldn't make heads or tails of it.
Okay.
Um, it just seemed nonsensical. None of it made any sense at all. And at one point, I read a draft, and then a few weeks later, I read another draft, and they were quite different. And I sent in notes on both, and then I found out they were from the same Chinese script, just with two different translators. And
Different
that's when I just said,
translations.
okay, I give up. I'll just trust Yang. Um, and if it hadn't been Yang doing it, it's not the kind of film I would have ever gotten hired to edit. I mean, to do a martial arts film.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really surprising movie. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, Skipping forward to the high frame rate. You've been involved in some of the, like, very pioneering films besides the Hobbit movies ongoing at a high frame rate. You guys went way way beyond there. Like uh was uh was Billy Lynn's halftime walk, was that 120 or it's
Yeah,
60?
it doesn't it doesn't make any sense to shoot anywhere between 24 and 120. And I'll explain that a little better in a minute.
Please.
If you shoot at 48, that's enough different to look weird and not enough different to solve the problem that you're trying to solve.
Hmm.
So let me back up a little bit. In 24, when you shoot in 24, um, and that's what we're all used to, and it's great. But there are two limitations. One is if you're shooting with a 180-degree shutter, that means your shutter speed is a 48th of a second, and there's motion blur that comes with that. And also there's a certain amount of strobing. You're exposing half the time, and the other half you're not.
Right.
You can cut down on motion blur by shortening the exposure, but then that makes the gaps and what's missing in the movement more noticeable. So you're kind of balancing strobing versus motion blur. And great artists have been doing this for a long time, and it's what we're used to. But there are certain like speeds of pans that everyone knows to avoid because it'll start strobing. There are certain speeds where you can't roll your credits because it'll strobe in a way that's annoying. 3D brings new issues. In 3D, strobing is more annoying than it is in 2D. And so to compensate for that, when you shoot in 3D, at 24, most DPs will open up the shutter angle to close to 300 degrees.
Okay.
But that adds more motion blur. It makes the strobing more manageable, but it adds more motion blur. And there was a scene in Life of Pi, several scenes, but one in particular in Life of Pi, where he's on a raft bobbing up and down in the ocean in a medium shot, and you can't see his face. He's acting, but he's kind of lost in motion blur. And we did some artificial stuff we replaced his eyes to try to just make him not disappear in this mess of blur. And the film that I wanted to do next involved boxers, and just thinking the way boxers move in the ring, not movie boxers, but real boxers. There's a lot of bobbing and weaving, and we were afraid that performance would just get lost. So we did a bunch of tests at higher frame rate.
Would be for
And
3D in the boxing movie.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And we found that, if a boxer is coming in toward you, toward the camera, at 24, it's a lot of exciting blur. And if he's coming in toward you, bobbing and weaving, and you're shooting at 60, you can see what he's thinking. It's a totally different experience.
Hmm.
And so we figured, okay, we should shoot this at 60 because theaters couldn't go higher than 60 anyway.
I've only seen Gemini Man in 60.
Yeah. But what we thought about it, if you're doing 60 and you have to deliver a 24, then that's a problem because 60 is 24 times 2.5. So how do you make a 24? Uh, there are ways using optical flow, but it's expensive and glitchy and complicated. But if you shoot at 120, that's 60 times 2, it's 24 times 5. And if you shoot with 180 or with a 360-degree shutter, which you can do with digital cameras, then you've recorded everything and you can combine frames in such a way that you can have a huge amount of control over what kind of, if to make the 60, for example, you could just show every other frame and that would
Hmm.
look exactly like you shot at 60 with a 180-degree shutter because it was
Okay.
exactly the same. But that has some strobing in it. If you watch 120 projected at 120, there's no strobing whatsoever. It's kind of uncanny. It does not look like film. It looks like something else. And you can, if there are ways that you can combine the frames, the 120 frames, to make a 60 that make it look better than if you shot it at 60. And you can make a 24 look better than if you shot it at 24. And you have control over different parts of the frame, different parts of the shot. If you shoot at 120, you can do all kinds of, you have a lot more control over what it's going to look like when you come down to 60 and 24. But then you can project at 120. I mean, theatrical, you need two projectors, but
Mm.
some theaters can do that. Dolby theaters can do that, Dolby Vision theaters, and it's amazing. But again, it's not a look that people are used to, and so it's audience acceptance is a funny thing. When HD first came in, people didn't like it, but then they saw sports in HD and they loved it, and then that got them used to it, and then now you never show anything in SD because it looks like garbage.
You think this is going to still catch on, and people are still going to go in this direction?
I don't know. I think there's certainly a lot of interest, technical interest, and the equipment is getting more and more capable. I don't know. What you need is a really good movie
Mm.
at 120. Something that delivers not just something interesting technically, but a great story. And let's see how the audience responds. But there is a lot of interest in it. Um, but it's a different look. And what we thought in when we were doing Billy Lynn is we thought we would go back and forth between what looks normal and what looks um, high frame rate, sort of enhanced. And uh, we have the ability to do that in editorial. In post, we had our own lab. What we discovered is you start it looking like 24, and it looks like 24, looks normal. Then you jump up to high frame rate, you don't jump up to 60, and it looks weird. It takes you out of the movie for a minute. And then you get used to it. After 5-10 minutes, you get used to it. And then you go back down to 24, and 24 doesn't look normal anymore. It looks terrible.
Mm.
And every time we switched, it took you out of the movie. And so what we thought we were going to do, this interesting thing of going back and forth, it turns out it doesn't really work very well. You would think in some cases, like a film like Ready Player One, for example, where we're going in and out of the real
Right.
world and the computer world, maybe there it would make sense to do all the inside the computer at a high frame rate at 60, say, and do outside at 24. But there's no justification for it in Billy Lynn, and it just seemed weird. So we stayed with some variation, but it's much more subtle. We stayed at high frame rate for the whole thing, but then it didn't really get released that way.
Oh. I remember in Jim and I Man really thinking that location work. I mean, like I think I read that you guys had to redo, or the on set they had to redo makeup in a different way just because you were seeing stuff in a detailed. Like
Yeah,
it's like 100 years of sophistication and filmmaking and figure out how to make things work with 24 frames. Suddenly it's like you with the Avid book, having to read Avid for the first time. It's a totally new.
yeah, you could see. I mean, they experienced a bit of that in the first Hobbit movie.
Yeah,
Is it
the
it it
sets in the
looked
first Hobbit movie
Yeah,
were rough
the sets would have been perfectly fine normally, but in this context, it looked like a bunch of guys on a set wearing costumes.
around styrofoam.
Um, yeah, so you had to step things up, and we had to change the approach to makeup a bit because the normal movie makeup didn't hold up. You can see it. So yeah, there were a lot of things that had to be done differently.
I remember thinking like a lot of natural light and a lot of on location stuff would look really great at the high frame rate.
Yeah,
Did
there's some
you?
big wide shots in Budapest and in Billy Lynn, some big wide shots that were supposed to be set in Iraq that we shot in Morocco. They're just stunning, and you can see forever in bright sunshine. And especially in 3D 4K at 120. Those shots, you just look at them all day.
I guess the next movie I was going to ask you about was Gosford Park. Going back into what we were talking about earlier with the sound editing, and I mean, I just how working with Altman. That's about to be bonkers.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, after McCabe and Mrs. Miller was one of the films that really got me going. Oh, this
That's a
is
favorite of mine
this is
too.
this is really interesting. That's a great movie. And then
Yeah.
you know 20 years later to get a call from Robert Altman that he wants me to come cut a movie for him. What a thrill. And it was a really interesting script. But when you first interview, the thing you talk about is the script because that's kind of where you start. You talk about process, but you also talk about the script. And I said I do have a couple of couple of notes on the scripts, couple things. And he said, "Oh, okay." And I said one, and he said, "Oh, yeah, I see your point." And then I said another, and he said, "I don't think I agree with you on that one." Then I started on another one. He said, "You know what? Don't worry about the script." And I just went, "What?" I had never
I
had
was going to
someone
say,
approach
it
things
sounds
that
like
way.
Altman would tell you not to worry about the script.
Yeah, yeah, that's the way he was. There was a script, but it changed a great deal during the shoot. He's the kind of director where, and it was similar in a way to Jonathan Demme, where everybody he hires, they bring their own thing, and he kind of directs everybody to be working in the same way, but he doesn't just tell everybody what to do and take over. And he didn't tell me what to do at all. The coverage was very weird on that movie. It was a huge cast of very big actors, and um, sometimes you would have they're in this house preparing things, and you see an extra walk by in the background carrying a tray, but it's Sir Derek Jacobi, and that's all he did in the scene was walk by in the background carrying a tray. Um,
How multi-camera would he have been?
they shot the whole thing with two. They shot the whole thing with two cameras. I don't think they ever shot. No, there were a couple of scenes they only shot with a single camera, but almost always two,
Well, I
and
mean,
never
I would
three.
imagine more, so that's nice. Only two.
No, the way they shot it was very weird. That the sort of a typical early filmmaker thing where you can get lost is a complicated table scene where people are talking with establish a whole bunch of different eye lines around a table. And normally a big scene with a lot, a 4-page scene of dialogue of people, a bunch of people sitting around a table, that'd be a couple of days of shooting, and they'd knock it out in 3 hours. And the way they would do it is they would just set up the two cameras on one side of the table, and they would dolly back and forth and get whatever they get, shoot 3 takes, move in a little tighter, do it again, go around to the other side, do it again, you're done. And English crews are real sticklers about coverage, and they were having aneurysms because nobody had ever, and apparently it was a big joke on set is let's see what the editor is going to do with that. And it was a challenge. Everything every editor has a whole process that they develop about how to turn an hour of dailies into a 1-minute scene. And my whole process didn't work on this footage. I had to kind of come up with something new. Um, but there wasn't a lot of footage.
How long was the edit on that?
Let's see. They shot April, May, June. We finished in October, so it was quick. I mean, we locked picture in 9 weeks.
I'm see. I've had this conversation recently more on doc stuff about like the real like I'm curious what your process is, but a lot of the time whenever you're guessing out time is just like I need time to look at the dailies and figure out what's going on or what's what.
Yeah,
And if you shoot a lot, which is great, like I need time to figure that out.
yeah. Um, it's while they're shooting, it's a good idea if you can to try to keep up with production. And some days it's easy. Some days they'll shoot all day and I can be done in an hour. But other days, they'll shoot for 6 hours and it'll take me 2 days to cut. Just depends on the nature of the footage. Um, but Gosford Park, there was not a whole lot of footage, and it was very complicated for me while they were shooting. But I was in New York and they were in London, and I wasn't really communicating with them. I was sending Bob cuts. I would always make tapes. At that time it was tapes, and I narrate them and send them, and just to make sure that you know that just to let him be confident that he was getting what he needed. But I didn't get any notes back about
Hmm.
what to do or anything like that, which I've never gotten notes from Ang either, um, or from Jonathan Demme for that matter.
Right.
Um, as long as the director is confident that they got what they needed, they should be worrying about what they're shooting tomorrow, not what they shot yesterday. Because
As long as you're keeping
shooting,
up.
yeah, as long as they think they got it, then there's nothing more that needs to be said. We can do that later. But so it was a very complicated, uh, first pass doing the assembly, and I did a lot of versions of everything because every scene was sort of a house of cards. Because you know, if I just want to switch from take 3 to take 7, well, in take 7 the camera was someplace different from where it was in take 3, so the cut doesn't work anymore. So if you like change one thing, you have to change everything. So I would do, usually I'd cut 2 or 3 versions of every scene, but on that film it was usually more than that. Um, and then I built an assembly. But by the time we showed the assembly, it was really good. It
Hmm.
was it was too long. It was about 3:15. But uh, but except for that, except for getting the time down, the assembly played really well. And mostly what Altman did, and again, we locked picture in 9 weeks. Um, we were I never saw more than maybe 4 hours a day, and often it was much less than that. He would come down the hall. We were set up in a the hotel where he had his office there, and we were in a little suite down the hall. And he'd come down and say, those 4 scenes where people were dressing for dinner, cut them up and mix the pieces together, and then he'd leave. That was the way he directed me on that. And I'd say, oh, okay, and that would keep me busy for a while. And I was like, oh, so now we have the dressing for dinner montage instead of the 4 scenes. And it's like, oh, that was a good idea. Um, but
I've
yeah,
ha-
he
I've
had
had this
a
conversation with other editors about there's certain editors who I think most editors like to be left alone. There's a lot of editors that like are okay with like couch behind me, the directors in the couch behind me tell me, and that sounds kind of heavenly to me. So,
yeah, yeah. And the great thing about that film was it was never broken. We never had to try to fix it.
mm,
It was just a matter of getting the time down and making it, bringing out the best in all the performances and finding all the good pieces, finding the balance between the drama and the humor. Um, but yeah, it was a fun, really enjoyable film.
I think Gosford Park's also going to be a transition into the movie we're supposed to be talking about for this episode. 50 minutes in, the Rachel getting married is one of my favorite movies of the last 20 years. It is what so how was the process? How did you first get involved with Demi? Did you get a script first? Was Demi involved when it came on or
Oh yeah, he I had met Jonathan a number of years earlier. Some sound people I know had always been telling me, "Oh, you should meet Jonathan Demme. I think you guys would really get along well." And then I actually ran into him uh, in a hotel. We were getting ready to go to a screening at the Cannes Film Festival of In the Mood for Love, and I was waiting for Ang to come down
oh
uh,
nice.
to get dressed, and I looked over across the lobby, and there was Jonathan Demme. So I went over and introduced myself, and he says, "Oh yeah, I heard about you. These sound guys have all been telling me I should meet you." Um, and he was a huge fan of Ride with the Devil. In fact, he
Okay.
kind of taught. There was a chase scene in that he taught at the Jacob Burns Film Center up in Westchester County. He did a class on. So
Oh, that's
so yeah,
cool.
we that was great. So he called me. Um, Again, this is a script that you read it seemed very loose, and I actually went on set the first day. I was just excited to be working with Jonathan, and it seemed like an interesting project. Uh, I went on set the first day, and both the script supervisor and the sound mixer took me aside and said, it was at lunchtime, and they both said, I don't know how to work this way. I don't know what you're going to do. It's completely out of control." And the film that I had done before that was Lost Caution for Ang Lee, which is
Okay.
possibly his best film. But it's a very intense, very tightly controlled film. And so then to go from that to Rachel getting married, which is the opposite. And Jonathan was, such a big, exuberant person, and it's very different from Ang. I love them both, but
Different.
it's the whole experience was really different and wonderful. And again, that footage, it was good that I had done Gosford Park because that kind of taught me a new way of editing, because Rachel Getting Married was Gosford Park on steroids. The way they shot it was very, very loose, and the script was changing all the time.
Back going to your first few credits, were you doing any docs at this point? Was that a muscle you felt like you had that helped
Yeah,
on this?
yes, very much. I had done a lot of documentary work. I'd done some stuff for Bill Moyers. Um, there was another documentary company. So before pushing hands, probably the majority of what I had done was in docs.
Okay.
So yeah, that was extremely helpful, because that's how they shot Rachel Getting Married, in to a large extent like a doc.
The crazier thing about whenever I was finishing watching the commentary before we started up, and the live music, that seems like the crazier aspect to it, like having to separate your tracks from the live music or whenever they bleed over.
Yeah, there were places where we, were shooting setups, um, of people talking, and the setup isn't going to go into the other room. It isn't going to go outside, but there were people in the backyard playing instruments, because that was going to be a part of the scene later. And I was like, really? You couldn't have had them not play the instruments? And
Just
that,
for a few takes, just for a few takes, don't play
yeah,
it. Maybe
yeah,
one. Just give your mood and
yeah,
stop after the one.
yeah. It was interesting. It created probably an interesting atmosphere for the actors, and there were certain wonderful things that came out of that, but there were some technical complications too. But we did very little ADR. There were maybe a couple places where we changed a few lines,
Jeez, really?
because we
Wow.
hadn't. But yeah, it was that one was complicated, and it was, Jonathan really wanted to keep the spontaneity of the
Did
performances.
did they help you with like wild lines or anything?
Not much, not
Okay.
much. But everybody was wearing a microphone, so I could pull things.
Okay.
Uh, but no, it was an interesting technical challenge. Maybe a little more challenging than it needed to be.
You guys shot for 33 days?
Yeah,
Were you on set for
yeah.
most of that?
No, I was on set very little. They were
Okay.
shooting in Stamford, Connecticut. No, they shot, they shot a normal amount of footage for a film, about 100 hours, but 100 hours in 33 days is a lot. Um, and so I wanted to try to keep up, and so I didn't really have time to go on set, because if I'm on set, I'm not working. I was on set some. There's a reason to be on set. Like on Life of Pi, there were a bunch of places where I had to be on set. And Gemini Man, there were some places where I had to be on set, but those are for specific reasons. Um,
Okay.
Often in reshoots, I'll be on set actually cutting stuff in to make sure everything works. But um, no, generally speaking, if I'm on set, means I'm not working.
You said you weren't getting any notes when you're assembling on this. He was just trying
No,
to get through his days.
yeah, and he didn't want to give me notes. They were shooting stuff, and he was happy with what I was sending him. And again, at the end of every day, I would send him one or two or three versions, well, two or three or four versions of everything. And he had never seen that before, so he got quite a kick out of it.
Hmm.
And and then when we started working together, I had all these all these different versions. I mean, to make the assembly, I have to go back, sift through all those old versions, and decide what I want to put in the assembly, whether it's one of those versions or more often some combination and then something new. But I would save all those things, and so he could refer back to them. Or if there were things that I made this decision, but that decision was good too, I would show that to him and save all of those. But yeah, so once we started working together, then the first thing that happened, there were a bunch of scenes where Anne Hathaway's character and the actor who's playing the best man, some big thing would happen, big dramatic thing, and then there'd be a scene where the two of them would talk about what happened. And then there's some other things that happen, and then the two of them would sit and talk about what happened. And we first thing we did was cut all those scenes out.
Okay.
We don't need to see them rehashing what we already went over, and what it tell us what it means to them. You want to do that very sparingly, if ever. in a movie.
How long?
And
How long was
there
your
were a bunch of
assembly?
those. Assembly on Rachel Getting Married was about 250 something, I think.
Okay. And I mean, with those scenes gone.
Yeah. Yeah, it came down quite a bit. Some of there were a bunch of montagey kind of scenes. That's an interesting thing. The wedding rehearsal. The wedding rehearsal was just a whole bunch of performances, people getting up on stage and performing. The way they shot that was they just did the whole thing with 5 cameras. Two of the cameras were our professional cameras by our camera operators, and then 3 of the cameras were held by guests so they could be in the shots. But I could use that footage too. And they just did it. They just did the whole thing through, and then went back and picked up just the ending, and that was it. They didn't shoot a whole, but they didn't shoot it in pieces. They didn't shoot it in takes. It was an hour-long take. And then the rehearsal dinner right after that, same thing. They just shot it through once. It's a 45-minute take with 5 cameras. And then they went and picked up this one little piece, but they shot it like a documentary. They didn't go back and get coverage. The coverage all had to be done the first time.
I guess I'm just kind of amazed that you caught up with production on that. That just blows my mind.
Yeah, I mean, I was a little bit behind at times, but Jonathan was happy. The last day of shooting was the scene where they're loading the dishwasher.
Mm.
Um, and you know, I was a little behind. I had some catching up to do, and I thought I looked at that, and it was had 3/4 of a page, and I thought, oh, this is going to be easy. And then I got the footage, and like, oh no,
Yeah.
no, this is a meal. That took a while. So I think between when they finished shooting and when we actually screened the assembly was probably a week and a half, because I just needed time to get the whole thing together. Because not only am I keeping up with the new footage, I'm going back and recutting the old footage and doing sound work and music, getting the music sorted out as much as we could. Another example of a scene, there's a couple of Narcotics Anonymous meetings. There are 2
Mm.
of them, and both of those were shot all the way through once, and that's it. The actors, each of the actors who gets up and tells a story, they had prepared their own thing, but nobody else knew what anybody else was going to say. None of that was scripted. None of that was in the script. So, and it wasn't clear what order people were going to go in. So they just ran it like, they started rolling the cameras, 3 cameras in this case. And people started walking in, they did the whole meeting, and then they left, went and had coffee and donuts, and then eventually they stopped the cameras. And that's how that scene was shot. And the second one of those, where Anne Hathaway tells her story, they shot the same way. All that's in the movie is a close up of her, a couple of angles because I had to cut it a bit. That's all that's in the movie, but they shot the whole meeting. And again, the other actors had their things to say, and she had her thing prepared, and that was scripted. But she waited until she felt the moment was right, and nobody knew when she was going to do it, and then she did her thing, and she did it once, and that was that. And that's what went in the movie.
See, one of the things I love most about this movie is, when a movie really works, it's this thing of details always being right, and it's a really hard thing. It's something that like to look effortless seems to be need a lot of editing, but I got the feeling how much of performance shaping was involved in what you were cutting.
Quite a bit.
Okay.
Quite a bit. I mean, when actors are free to ad lib that way, you get a lot of variety,
Mm.
and trying to, and Jonathan encouraged that, but it means sometimes it is complicated putting together let alone the best performance, but also just a coherent performance. Sometimes to
Mm.
make it seem like the person is, consistent enough through the whole scene. Um, But the actors, some actors respond to that kind of environment really well, and some less so. But most of these actors were quite good at that. And there's some, I mean, there's some spectacularly bad editing in that movie. I mean, bad in the classical
You
sense.
know, I was listening to the commentary, and you were talking about this on the commentary, and I know the one cut you pointed out is a kitchen cut where there was a uh, in both the producer and Janine LeMay, the screenwriter, both like, no, it's fine. I have to say I sided with them because I remember thinking
Yeah.
like, yeah, there's a line jump on there, but I was part of like, it looks. I didn't
Well,
notice it until you said
it's
anything.
yeah, it's fine. I mean, it sounds perfect, but if you actually look at the positions of the
Yeah,
actors,
after you
Bill
pointed it
Irwin
out, I was
is
like, yes, they're different. They're in different spots.
he's
Yes, after you pointed it
facing
out.
the completely opposite direction. There's a in the dishwasher scene. There's a jump cut. Um, it doesn't sound like a jump cut, but the Tunde Adebempe, the groom, his position just cuts from one shot to another. It's the same
Mhm.
setup, but he just moves. The camera moves, but the sound plays straight through. You wouldn't do a cut like that in Sense and Sensibility, but in a film like Rachel Getting Married, it's fine.
I
In
mean,
fact, it's good. It's a good sort of energetic cut, I think.
I mean, to each movie its own aesthetic, but at the same time, watching Rachel Getting Married again, I just like, why can't more movies be like that? Like, there's so
Yeah,
much life and great performances in this movie that, like, if continuity is what robs us from this in other movies, damn continuity, you know?
yeah. There was another kind of weird cut. Think going back to Gosford Park. There was a scene where a number of the below stairs staff are in a room talking, and because the camera's doing something different every time, it's panning back and forth essentially between Clive Owen and Alan Bates. And the way I had to cut the scene is at one point we cut to Alan Bates and pan over to Clive Owen, and then cut to Alan Bates and pan over to Clive Owen, and then cut to Alan Bates and then pan over to Clive Owen. And Altman thought 3 times was too many. And we did it so what's in the movie is twice, but
Okay.
I was very happy that I had
You
out
got the
weirded
two in.
Robert Altman. Yeah. Well, just that I found out where the limit was. Because again, there's some peculiar editing in that movie, but you get away with it because of the aesthetic of the movie.
I think one of the big reasons I want to talk about this movie, one of my favorite, I mentioned it being a favorite movie of the last 20 years, but really the scene that kills me every time, like even watching the commentary, I kind of cried a little. Like I cry every time I see this scene, is the unknown legend, the wedding vows. Whenever Tunde Ndubepe sings the Neil Young song, that
Yeah.
I mean, I first saw this movie. I was still a theater projectionist, and I was working in Austin, and um, we got the press screening. We would get press screenings, and I remember I would watch all these great movies with press screens like that, especially right after something like I think you guys debuted in North America at Toronto for
Yeah, I
Rachel
believe
Getting
so.
Married.
Yeah, I
It
think
would have been
so.
right after that. And maybe it was for Austin Film Festival. Used to get the holdovers from Toronto, and so I'm just watching this in a empty theater at 3 a.m. and just bawling, seeing that scene, and it's just there's a reason I think this is one of Jonathan Demme's best movies, just because like I feel like Jonathan Demme. We've done. I was starting to think about. We've technically done two other episodes on Jonathan Demme movies. We did a episode on Swing Shift with the director's cut of that. We did a movie he produced called Miami Blues. But every Jonathan Demme movie has so much personality and so much life in it, and that sequence, the wedding, all the stuff just is the one that's just like pushes it more than anything else. It's not abrasive, it's not annoying, it's not candy coated either because there's so much conflict in this movie, but I don't know, that the
Yeah.
wedding the song just kills me every time.
Yeah, and it feels right for the character, and it feels really real. And Rachel, Rosemary DeWitt's response to it is so good. That pulls you into it too. She was wonderful in that movie. Um,
Good reaction makes
yeah,
the
it's just
actor work.
yeah, and it's you just that's one of the big things you do as an editor is when I saw those dailies and he started singing, I had no idea who was going to do that. The script didn't say it, and it
Really?
got me. Yeah, it got me, and I said, okay, I trust that emotion that I just felt was genuine, so I'm going to keep that. No, even after I've seen the movie 70 times and get bored with it, I'm going to remember how I felt the first time, because the
Right.
audience is going to be seeing it the first time. Um, that's a real danger sometimes is editing is you can get bored with where you are and
Yeah.
start throwing away things that work well. And
Yeah.
that's one reason why it's always helpful to keep showing it to an audience.
Yeah. Um, I know I saw the behind the scenes on the Blu-ray. There was a theater screening Q&A that you were at, and Jonathan Demme said at one point that you were just putting on stuff that he normally wouldn't have put in, or especially in the wedding, and he was happy with that. And you were like, I'd pay for more of this.
Yeah, it was, the wedding, wedding guests and the performances after the wedding and people dancing and stuff. We got lots and lots of footage of that. And so it's a question of how much of that do you put in? It's not, a lot of it is not necessary for the storytelling, but it kind of puts you in the mood. It's indulgent in a good way. I mean, you have
In
to
a good
find
way.
where the line is between indulgent in a good way and indulgent not in a good way.
Right.
Um, and in fact, at one point we had just about locked picture, and then we kind of went back and pared a couple more things out because we showed it to a new audience, and it did feel a little bit long. Stuff that had
Mm,
always felt good started to feel a little long, so I went back and into people
okay.
dancing after the wedding and cut a few more shots out. Um, but yeah, finding those kinds of what feels like real emotions and great moments. I mean, there's a scene, terrific scene, maybe my favorite scene in the movie, where they come back from the rehearsal dinner and they start in the kitchen and the girls start bickering, and then
This
they
is the
go into the living
watermelons
room.
fight scene.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the shot I'm talking about is this watermelon, one of the watermelon shots, where the girls are really going at it in the kitchen, and we cut, and somebody says something that kind of stops the conversation, and we cut over to the best man and the bridesmaid, and the best man is just kind of sitting there eating some watermelon, looking, just watching. He's not scripted as doing anything in this scene, but he was just there and present in a way that was so interesting. And in that, that was a 10-minute scene, and they shot it in 10-minute takes. The cameras just went different ways each time, but the actors didn't know when they were on camera. It's not like they were ever saving it for their close up. So he was just there, and he would do. There's this moment where he's just kind of looking back and forth, eating watermelon, and I thought that just made the scene. It's
I
obviously
think
there's lots of other good stuff in the scene too, but it's like moments like that are wonderful.
in the commentary you say, I think Rosemary DeWitt has the big line where she reveals she's pregnant. You
Yeah,
said that was a first take.
yeah. If I said it, I'm sure it's true.
No, it's just first take for that delivery and just
Yeah,
the shape of that scene. Um,
yeah. And the way the energy in the scene changes when she says that, it's this kind of tense thing, but you see this family has bickered a lot before, because it's not like everybody else in the room is sitting there embarrassed and horrified. They've all seen some stuff before. So
yeah,
and then she says she's pregnant, and everything changes, and Hathaway's reaction to that is so wonderful. Um, and it wasn't in every take, but
the commentary was better than I thought.
go ahead.
I hadn't listened to it, and and for a movie I've seen that many times, there's a lot of insight that I hadn't picked up on. What was the was there any story shaping done, or was like what kind of did you have to move stuff around? It was mostly just
Oh
bringing it
yeah,
down, or okay,
no, we move stuff around.
what kind of stuff moved around?
Oh, let's see. I don't think I have a good answer to that question.
Okay,
I remember that we shuffled things, but I mean that's normal. So it's not like it was
yeah,
particularly noteworthy that you shuffle things around. It's rare that you don't. So
right,
sometimes
okay,
you'll have two scenes, a couple of scenes, and you take out the scene that's in between them, and then you put them together now, and it doesn't work very well. So you have to kind of move one of them. But I don't remember any specific instances of that. I just know that we fiddled around with the scene order as you usually do.
you only you worked with Jonathan Demme one more time after this?
Yeah, on a very little film. It's called A Master Builder. It's a
Okay,
adaptation of the Ibsen play with Wally Shawn and Andre Gregory. Wonderful, wonderful little film. I did that right after Life of Pi. In fact, I assembled it while we were finishing Life of Pi. Um, I was in Los Angeles, and I had all the dailies, and so nights and weekends
Oh,
I was
damn.
doing that. Well,
Okay.
I assembled I assembled Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon nights and weekends while I was working 60 hours a week on a TV series. Um, so yeah, that was a busy fall. Uh, but yeah, this other film, it was an adaptation of a play. They had been workshopping it for 14 years, I think. Shot it in 7 days. I thought it was going to be really easy. It was not. It was turned out to be very complicated. But I just wanted the opportunity to work with Jonathan again after Life of
Right.
Pi, which was a great job, great film, but long and grueling. And it just seemed like a pleasant thing to do,
Hmm.
to have the chance to work with Jonathan again, because I really enjoyed working with him. Rachel Getting Married, in my mind, it's a comedy
Okay.
because we had so much fun making it. There's the film itself, and then there's the experience of making the film.
Right.
And you can make a lousy film but have it be a good experience, and vice versa. Sometimes a great film is a terrible experience. Um, Rachel Getting Married was a really fun experience. I had a great crew where we were working. We had a lot of other people with us. Jonathan's a blast. Jonathan was a blast, and I just, in my mind, it was just a really pleasant, enjoyable experience. And especially coming after Lost Caution, which was great, but so emotional, but a different, intense, tightly controlled, pressure cooker, and then to go from that to Rich Getting Married was a real pleasure. And then so a few years later, when Jonathan asked me to do this other thing, I was happy to do it. I was originally going to cut Ricky and the Flash for him,
I
which
was
is the
about to
film he
ask you about
did.
Ricky and the Flash.
Yeah, but I was on Broken, Angelina Jolie's film, and that went longer, and eventually it was going to be too big an overlap, and so I had to back out.
I don't think enough people like Ricky and the Flash either. But one of the things that relates to Rachel Getting Married is I think Rachel Getting Married is just one of the best movies I've ever seen about forgiveness. And structurally, it's just weird. It's a great movie where there's just the movie doesn't end with the type of blowouts that you would normally expect a family drama to have, where there's a catharsis where someone makes a point, where everyone like I think
Yeah,
there's Anne Hathaway says at one point in an interview that like whoever wins the argument is the last person that speaks, and then the end of the movie is just about everyone acknowledging kind of silently. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of
yeah,
dialogue in the last 20 minutes, and Ricky and the Flash structurally is kind of the same way too, where there's a lot of family conflict, and then it ends at a concert with Meryl Streep, where her kids have to kind of like come to terms with the mother they love and the mother that loves them back too.
yeah, yeah. I mean, the great thing about the ending of Rachel Getting Married, it's emotional, but nobody gives the big emotional speech. It's
Right.
just, they said what they needed to say. They said what they wanted to say earlier. Talking isn't the solution to the problem. It's the emotions that they feel at the wedding that hopefully the audience goes along with them and feels some of those things too. And you just see things change without there being an explanation for it. And I think, that's the way life often really is. I think it feels very genuine. And yeah, that was, you know, you don't that scene with the big emotional speech that ties things up. There wasn't in the script. There was none. That's not how problems get solved in this movie, or usually not in the real world either.
Yeah. I mean, Rachel Getting Married ends with a wedding. Ricky and the Flash ends with their mother singing a song to them, and it's just
Yeah,
such a nonverbal way of. I've been thinking a lot lately, and rewatching Getting Married, kind of thought about this. Like the if you go back to the basic of the Aristotle idea of dramatics and conflict, and how conflict is what supposedly everyone's interested in watching, I think when it comes to the family drama, conflict is so natural. Like, and what's interesting about a movie like this is it just feels more like a real family. It just feels like the fights are natural, but the way they resolve feels like your normal family. You're never going to get your family to like say they have a speech and say they were right or you were right. You know, it's just at the end of
yeah,
the day, like you're
yeah,
still the family's there.
yeah, yeah. It all felt very authentic. I thought, Bill Irwin has some. He plays the father. Just has some wonderful moments where he's very conflicted. I mean, his whole past with the way he's dealt with his daughter. He hasn't always done everything right, and his other daughter calls him out on it, and I thought he was just wonderful in that movie. Um, so just authentic and interesting. He's not just there. Bill Irwin's always, you can always kind of count on him to do something interesting.
I can't say enough about the performances of the movie. They're so detailed, they're so distinct, but the details feel right. They feel so right in this movie. You guys came up with the title in editing. I saw
Yes, it was.
Dancing with Shiva was on one of the slates.
Yeah, we spent quite a while trying to figure out what to call the movie, because Dancing with Shiva seemed like it was just setting people up for a different kind of movie.
Sure.
So Rachel getting married. It's a line that one of the musicians says in the rehearsal dinner. And he says, and he repeats, "Rachel getting married."
Right.
So we thought, Jonathan came up with that.
Okay. Um, I want to ask about Jonathan Demme's son is in the movie and his dogs are in the movie. Is
Yeah.
I know my experience with a director, if they have family members in the movie or pets in the family, those are the scenes that are hardest to cut out. I don't know if that was your experience with this.
I didn't want to cut those scenes out.
Well, it works out.
Yeah, and the dog was wonderful. The dog is the best animal actor I've ever seen. Because sometimes a really well trained dog, they won't do anything. They'll kind of hit
Right.
their marks, but they won't do anything. Olive, that big poodle, um, Olive did things. Olive was always interesting. She was always gave 100%, um, and never messed up a shot. But was always happy to be there. It was wonderful, and his kids, I never had any problem with those scenes.
Well, cool. I think that's all I got. Tim, thank you so much for being on the podcast and doing this. I appreciate.
Sure.
This is a pleasure. I love this movie to death.
No, I'm glad. I'm glad. Sometimes you do a movie and you send it out in the world and you never know um, what people think. And
Well,
this
especially
wasn't a
if like
huge hit.
you jump back and forth between some bigger movies and this, like the smaller movies, but this one, yeah, it's stuck with me over these years. Thanks, man.
Great. I'm glad to hear it.